The desert sun leaned low, spilling gold across the wide, empty street of the village. Dust swirled with each lazy breath of wind, clinging to the wooden porches of shuttered shops and creaking saloons. The year was 1887, and though the town had once promised hope to settlers pushing westward, it had withered into a place where strangers were watched with suspicion and the weak were left behind. On this day, the air held a heaviness, not from the heat, but from the cruel whispers carried on at whispers about a blind girl no one wanted. She stood near the edge of the boardwalk, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for a sound that might guide her. Her long red hair tumbled loosely down her back, catching the dying sunlight like fire, though her pale face betrayed no warmth. A strip of cloth tied across her eyes concealed what she had lost, but it couldn't hide the loneliness written in her stillness. She didn't move much except to draw her thin fingers across the wooden post beside her, as though memorizing its shape. Children sometimes stopped and stared, hushed by their mothers who tugged them along quickly. Men spat into the dirt and shook their heads, muttering things about curses or burdens. The town, already weary from too much hunger and too little fortune, had no place for her. The girl had no family left, at least none who claimed her. Some said her parents had been taken by fever. Others whispered that they had simply walked away, unable to bear the shame of raising a daughter who would never see. Whatever the truth, she had become the town's ghost, living only because no one had yet mustered the cruelty to end her story outright. She survived on scraps, on the occasional kindness of a passing hand, but mostly on silence. That evening, as shadows stretched across the ground, a horse's hooves broke the stillness. Heads turned, and the rhythm of conversation fell into hush. Out of the horizon's dust rode an Apache warrior, his figure tall and unbending in the saddle. His skin bore the burnished bronze of endless sun, his dark hair spilling past his shoulders, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He led another horse, a strong black stallion with restless muscles rippling beneath its hide. The stranger did not ride into town as if seeking welcome. He entered like one who expected neither greeting nor mercy, but who feared neither. The people stiffened. Old wounds between settlers and tribes ran deep, scars of raids and skirmishes not long forgotten. Mothers gathered children closer. Men's hands twitched near their belts, though none dared draw. The Apache dismounted without hurry, his boots raising small clouds of dust. He let the reins of the black stallion slip free as his gaze settled on the blind girl standing. Alone, a murmur passed through the onlookers. Why would his eyes find her? What interest could an Apache have in a girl the town itself had abandoned? The girl did not see him approach, but she heard the silence that followed the way breath itself seemed to pause. Her lips parted slightly as though sensing the weight of someone's presence near her. The warrior stopped in front of her. For a long moment he simply studied her, his face unreadable. Then, with a gentleness at odds with his hardened frame, he reached out. The girl flinched, but his touch was steady as he untied the blindfold, revealing pale, sightless eyes that searched the nothingness before them. A gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The Apache said nothing. Instead, he placed his hand lightly on her arm, guiding her step by step until they stood before the stallion. The animal tossed its head, but at a wordless command, it grew still. Without hesitation, he lifted the girl, placing her upon the horse's back as though she weighed nothing more than air. The townsfolk stared, unable to decide if this was an abduction, a rescue, or something stranger still. Some muttered that the warrior must be bewitched, others that he sought revenge, taking with him a burden the town had long wished gone. But no one moved forward. The tension hung sharp as a blade. The girl, though frightened, did not resist. For the first time in her life, perhaps, she felt steady hands guiding her, not out of pity, but with purpose. Her breath caught as the horse shifted beneath her, its power alive under her fragile frame. She tilted her head, listening to the silence that surrounded her, and felt the strange certainty that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet name. The warrior swung himself into the saddle behind her. His arms framed her slight figure, his hands holding the reins with ease. The horse snorted, impatient, its hooves restless against the ground. The people of the town could only watch, frozen between fear and awe. Then, with a sharp command, the Apache dug his heels lightly against the stallion's side. The horse surged forward, dust rising in their wake. The blind girl held her breath as the world moved faster than it ever had beneath her. The town grew smaller behind them, its people nothing more than shadows fading into the dusk. But not all eyes turned away. A few men exchanged glances heavy with suspicion, and one stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This isn't the last we've seen of her," he muttered. "Mark my words, there'll be trouble." The desert stretched ahead, endless and merciless, but also vast with promise. The girl clung to the feel of the wind, the rhythm of the horse, and the warmth of the man who had taken her from the place that had never wanted her. Yet deep within, uncertainty gnawed. Who was he? Why had he chosen her? And where was he carrying her, away from the only world she had known? The answers lay beyond the horizon, but the night was already gathering. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to the rising moon, their cries weaving into the girl's thoughts. She did not know if she was heading toward salvation or into a deeper wilderness of danger. All she knew was that the Apache had placed her on his horse and ridden away, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. And, as the hoofbeats carried them further from the village, the question that lingered, unspoken but heavy as the desert sky, was whether the girl had been saved from her fate, or delivered to it. The desert swallowed the sound of hooves as the Apache stallion carried them further from the village, its strength steady beneath the blind girl's fragile form. She gripped the saddle, uncertain of everything except that she was no longer standing alone in the dust where people turned their backs on her. The air was sharp with the scent of sage and dry earth, and each gust of wind seemed to pull her further away from the life she had known. Behind her, she could feel the warmth of the warrior's chest, solid and unyielding, as though nothing in the wide land could move him from his purpose. Night crept faster in the desert than in town. The girl had no way to see the fading light, but she sensed the change as the air cooled, carrying the distant call of coyotes and the whisper of grass bending in the breeze. She wanted to ask where they were going, why he had taken her, and what fate lay ahead. Yet her lips stayed closed, for his silence pressed on her like the weight of a stone. She had never felt so small, so caught between fear and strange wonder. Behind them, the village had already begun to stir with speculation. Men gathered at the saloon, their voices gruff and uneasy. Some claimed the Apache had bewitched the girl, others said he sought ransom or revenge. A few laughed harshly, saying good riddance to a burden they had all secretly wished gone. But even in their callousness, unease gnawed at them. The sight of the warrior lifting her so gently had unsettled their certainty. If the Apache had only wanted trouble, he could have brought it in another way. Why her? That question would not leave them. The girl, meanwhile, swayed with the rhythm of the stallion's stride. For the first time in years, she felt motion that carried her somewhere new, not just the blind groping along familiar paths. She remembered the whispers of neighbors, the scraps of food handed with reluctance, the cold nights when no door opened to her. Now the desert wind tugged at her hair, and though fear clung to her, so did a faint flicker of hope and ember she had long thought dead. At last, the horse slowed, and the Apache drew them to a stop near a cluster of rocks that rose like dark sentinels. He slid from the saddle, then reached up to lift her down. His hands were steady, strong but careful, as though he knew her fragility and would not let her break. She felt the ground beneath her feet again, rough and uneven. He led her to sit on a flat stone, then tended to his horse. The stallion snorted softly as if eager to run further, but settled under his touch. The girl listened to the sounds, the brushing of hands along the animal's neck, the shifting of hooves, the creak of leather straps. She could not see him, yet she imagined the way he moved, deliberate and sure, like one who had learned to survive in a land that gave nothing freely. When he returned to her side, he spoke at last. His voice was low, edged with an accent she had rarely heard, but his words were clear enough. "The town did not want you." Her breath caught at the truth in his simple statement. She turned her face slightly, unable to meet his gaze, though her eyes saw nothing. "No," she whispered. "They left you to stand alone," he continued. his tone more observation than question. Yes, her hands twisted in her lap, pale fingers knotting together. Always alone. A pause followed, long enough that she wondered if he would speak again. Then he said, "Now you are not alone." Something in her chest stirred, though she dared not believe it. "Why?" she asked. "Why me?" But he gave no answer. Instead, he rose and began gathering dry brush, the crackle of twigs snapping beneath his hands filling the silence. Soon, the scent of smoke curled into the air. She felt the warmth of a small fire push back the chill of the desert night. As the flames grew, so too did her questions. Who was he? Why had he taken her from the village? What would become of her in the wilderness, where she could not even see the ground beneath her feet? Yet for every question, silence answered. The fire popped and hissed, the horse shifted nearby. And above them, the stars burned unseen in a sky she could not imagine. The girl thought of the stories she had overheard in the town. Stories of the Apache painted with fear and suspicion. Words like raider, savage, enemy. Yet the hands that had lifted her were not cruel. The voice that had spoken to her was not filled with anger. Still, unease lingered. She had been taken, not asked. And though the town had never wanted her, at least it had been familiar. Out here every sound was a mystery. Every step unknown. The Apache sat across from her now, silent as stone, watching the fire. His thoughts were hidden, though his eyes missed nothing. He studied the girl, how she sat with her head tilted slightly, as if trying to catch every sound. He wondered if she knew how much strength it took to live unwanted, and if she realized that the fire in her hair was matched by something in her spirit. The night deepened. Coyotes cried again, closer this time. The horse flicked its ears but stayed calm, reassured by the presence of its master. The girl folded her arms, leaning toward the fire, her mind churning with fear and questions she dared not voice. She wanted to ask if he would take her back, if he meant to leave her here, or if this journey had only just begun. But the words tangled in her throat. At last, when she thought she could no longer hold the silence, he spoke once more. "The desert is wide," he said. "It does not give mercy, but it teaches truth." She frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "And me? What truth is there for me?" His gaze flickered to her blind eyes. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face, a thought heavy as the desert stones. But he only answered, "You will learn." The fire burned low, and the girl drew her arms tighter, listening to the endless quiet. She felt both smaller than ever and yet strangely alive, as though for the first time she was stepping into a story that belonged to her. She did not know if it would end in hope or sorrow, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her life was no longer hers alone, and as the desert stretched around them, vast and unyielding, the path ahead remained hidden. She could not see it, and he would not speak it. Suspense lingered like the echo of hoofbeats in the night, promising that what lay before them was only the beginning of something neither the girl nor the Apache could yet name. The morning came gray and thin, the desert winds restless, as if carrying whispers from unseen places. The blind girl woke to the crackle of dying embers, her hands stiff from the cold night, her ears tuned to the steady sounds of the Apache preparing his horse. She could feel tension in the air, something unspoken but heavy, as though danger waited just beyond the rocks. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat listening, wondering if this new life would demand more strength than she possessed. Back in the village, unease had grown into something sharper. The saloon had filled late into the night with men who spoke in hard voices, their words tangled with whiskey and suspicion. By dawn, rumors spread faster than truth. Some claimed the Apache had taken the girl to trade her to another tribe. Others whispered darker intentions. Yet beneath the harsh talk, a seed of guilt stirred. Few would admit it aloud, but they all knew they had abandoned her long before he carried her away. Now her disappearance left a stain on their conscience. And stains in a small town never stayed hidden for long. The sheriff, a weary man with lines carved deep around his eyes, stood at the heart of the unrest. He knew the land, knew its people, and knew too well the fragile thread of peace that held between settlers and the Apache. If the girl had gone willingly, it might be one story, but if not, blood could follow. He gathered a posse not out of compassion for the girl, but out of duty to keep the balance from shattering. Still, a nagging thought haunted him. Why had the Apache chosen her of all people? Far from town, the girl's world shrank to sounds and touch. The rhythm of hooves, the warmth of the sun as it climbed, the feel of rough leather reins pressed into her palm when he guided her to hold them for balance. She began to notice the way he watched over her, not as captor but as guardian. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. "Listen," he told her once, and she heard the cry of a hawk high above, sharp and cutting through the sky. "Smell," he said another time, and she caught the sweetness of blooming cactus after rare rain. Still, doubt clung to her. She could not shake the fear that he might tire of her weakness, might leave her in some lonely canyon. Yet, as the days stretched, she also felt something else, something like a thread binding her to a fate she did not yet understand. The Apache carried his own burdens. In his silence lay memories of battles fought, treaties broken, and promises turned to ash. He had seen cruelty in many forms, both from his own people and from those who came to claim the land. The girl had been cast aside by her own, a wound he recognized, though it was not marked on skin. In her blindness, he saw not weakness, but a mirror of his own exile. Yet the path he had chosen was not simple. His people would not welcome her easily, and the settlers would not forget. To carry her was to carry conflict, and conflict had a way of finding blood as they traveled deeper into the desert. The girl began to sense shadows of other dangers. One night, she heard voices on the wind, not his, not her own. Strangers moved in the distance, their campfires' faint glows hidden behind ridges. He tensed when he noticed his hand resting on the rifle strapped across his horse. He said nothing, but she felt the shift in the air. The quiet readiness of a man who had lived too long on the edge of survival. She did not know who those others were. Outlaws, hunters, now men from the town, but their presence pressed like a storm waiting to break. Meanwhile, the village women whispered among themselves. Some pitied the girl now that she was gone, weaving tales of how she might return, changed or not at all. Others feared she would bring retribution upon them, that the Apache had taken her as a warning. Among them, a young boy, one of the few who had ever shown the blind girl kindness, lingered near the edges of the gossip. His small hands clenched into fists, for he remembered sharing bread with her when others turned away. He vowed quietly to himself that if she returned, he would not let her be cast out again. But he was only a boy, and boys' promises rarely stopped the cruelty of men. The days grew harsher as the land stretched wide, the sun unrelenting, the nights colder than bone. The girl learned to walk when he guided her hand, to sit still when danger stirred, to trust the sound of his voice above all else. Yet each step into the wilderness only deepened the mystery. She did not know if he meant to deliver her somewhere, to teach her something, or to keep her forever hidden from the world she once knew. He too wrestled with questions. He remembered the look on her face when the villagers turned away, how she stood like a ghost no one wished to see. He had taken her not out of impulse, but out of defiance against a world that discarded its own. But now, as he watched her struggle to match his pace, he wondered if he had burdened her with a destiny she could not bear. Conflict stirred on all sides. The posse from the town rode hard, their distrust sharpening into determination. Strangers in the desert moved like hunters waiting for prey. The Apache's own people, if they learned of her, would demand answers he was not certain he could give. And the girl herself, though silent and small, carried within her a spark that could shift the balance of all their lives. One evening, as the sky bled into deep crimson, they paused at the edge of a canyon. The wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it the scent of rain from far away. The Apache stood tall, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. The girl stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the rock, feeling its rough truth beneath her fingers. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of something approaching. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. The village that cast her out, the desert that tested every soul, the unseen enemies lurking in shadows, all threads of a conflict tightening around them. The girl did not yet know the shape of her fate, and the Apache could not see the end of the road. But both understood one thing in that silence. They were not moving toward peace, but toward a storm that would demand everything they had left to give. The canyon winds cut sharp that night, carrying with them the scent of dust and danger. The Apache's eyes swept the darkness. Every movement around him weighed for meaning. The blind girl sat close to the fire, her small hands pressed together, her ears straining to catch what she could not see. She felt the unease pressing down on them both, like the stillness before lightning splits the sky. Every sound seemed louder, the snap of twigs in the fire, the restless shift of the stallion's hooves, the sigh of the desert rocks settling. Something was coming. She could not name it, but her bones felt it. Far behind them, the posse from the town pressed onward. Their lanterns bobbed like false stars across the barren plains. The sheriff led them with grim determination, his jaw set hard against the chill that crawled into his chest. The men behind him argued in hushed tones, some thirsty for confrontation, others uneasy about chasing into Apache lands. But the thought of returning empty-handed gnawed at them worse than the fear. Pride and guilt rode with them. Sharper than any bullet, the girl and the Apache pressed further into the wilderness, each day heavier than the last. The sun bore down, the rocks tore at their boots, and still they moved forward. She asked once softly, "Are they coming?" He paused before answering, and though his words were quiet, they struck her like a blow. Yes, men always come. At night, when the fire burned low, she lay listening to the beat of her own heart. She thought of the village's narrow streets, its cold silences, the way eyes slid past her as if she were not there. She had believed she could not be more afraid than when left alone in that dust. But now the fear was different. It was larger, stretched across the desert, and it carried the weight of choice. She was no longer forgotten. She was hunted. The Apache remained silent most of the time, but she began to read the tension in his breath, the way his hands lingered near his rifle, the way his stallion moved restless in the dark. She understood then that he was not only leading her away from the town, but also into something deeper, something she could not yet name. By the third night, shadows moved closer. The girl sensed them even before he did, the faint crack of a branch, the low murmur of voices carried on the wind. She leaned forward, whispering, "They are near." He studied her with eyes sharp as flint, surprised by the keenness of her hearing. Without a word, he doused the fire and pulled her to her feet. The world vanished into blackness, but for her it was no different. Darkness was her constant. They slipped into the canyon, the rocks swallowing them whole, and behind them, distant shouts echoed like ghosts. The posse found the remains of the fire at dawn. One man spat into the dirt, muttering curses. The sheriff crouched low, studying the faint tracks pressed into the ground. He knew the Apache was drawing them deeper, away from safety, into lands where the desert itself became an enemy. Still, he pushed them forward. The men followed, though every step thickened their unease. As the chase deepened, the girl began to feel her bond with the Apache tighten. He spoke to her more now, teaching her to walk by the sound of water dripping, to sense the way air shifted when a canyon narrowed, to find her way by the warmth of the sun on her face. Each lesson carried urgency, as though he prepared her for something neither of them could stop. But the danger was not only behind. One evening, as they crossed a dry riverbed, the stallion shied and snorted. The Apache froze. A shadow moved at the ridge above them, then another. The girl clutched his arm, sensing the air thicken. He lifted his rifle slowly, his body tense as a bowstring. For a long moment, silence ruled. Then a stone rolled down the slope, and voices rang out. Not the posse, strangers. Outlaws, hungry and desperate. Their eyes catching the faint glint of firelight, the Apache pulled her close, shielding her with his own body. "Stay low," he told her. His voice was steady, but she could hear the storm beneath it. Shots cracked through the night, bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. She pressed herself against the ground, heart hammering, the dust choking her lungs. He fired back, each shot deliberate, his stance unyielding. The stallion screamed, tether jerking, hooves pounding the earth. The clash lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. When it ended, silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The girl dared to lift her head. She heard the Apache's steps, steady, unbroken, and knew he had driven them off. Yet, she also knew the noise had carried far. The posse would hear. The desert would carry the echoes like a signal. By dawn, they moved again, faster now. The girl's feet ached, her throat burned, but she did not complain. She sensed the weight of every moment. Each ridge they crossed could reveal enemies. Each canyon could become a trap. She leaned into the rhythm of his voice when he guided her, trusting it more than sight ever could have given her. Back in the town, whispers had turned to shouts. Some men demanded that the sheriff bring her back at any cost. Others feared the Apache would bring war upon them all. The boy who had once shared bread with her sat on the steps of the saloon, listening with clenched fists. He wanted to tell them they had no right to speak of her now after the way they had cast her out. But he swallowed his words, for he was only a boy in a world ruled by men with guns. The desert grew harsher still. A storm brewed one night, lightning cracking across the horizon, rain slashing down in sudden torrents. The girl clung to the Apache as the stallion pushed through mud and water, the roar of the storm drowning every thought. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Yet she knew they were racing towards something greater than the storm itself. When the skies cleared, the land lay transformed, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. But danger did not wash away. The posse was closer now. She could almost feel their breath at her back. The Apache knew it too. His silence deepened, his movements sharper. Each decision weighted with urgency. On the sixth night, they reached the edge of a vast mesa. From there, the world stretched endless and unforgiving. The girl stood at the edge, feeling the wind tear at her hair, hearing the emptiness below. She asked softly, "Will they find us here?" The Apache looked across the land, his jaw tight. "Yes," he said. Here, everything is seen. Behind them, the posse pushed harder, their torches flickering like the eyes of predators in the night. The sheriff's horse foamed at the mouth, yet he would not stop. He felt the chase closing, the moment drawing near when choices would cut sharper than any blade. The girl and the Apache camped one last time before the inevitable. She sat beside the fire, listening to the crackle, feeling the storm inside her chest. She thought of her life in the village, of every door closed, every cruel word, every empty day. And she thought of this journey, the desert, teaching her to listen, to endure, to feel more deeply than sight ever could. She had not asked for this path, yet it had carried her to the edge of something vast and unshakable. The Apache watched her in silence, his mind torn between duty and defiance. He had chosen to lift her from the dust, but now the weight of that choice pressed harder than the desert sun. To protect her meant standing against all settlers, strangers, even his own people, if they turned against him. He felt the storm gather, and he knew it could not be delayed much longer. The night stretched thin, the stars burning cold above. In the distance, the faint glow of torches marked the posse's approach. The girl turned her head, sensing their nearness, though she could not see. Her voice trembled, yet it carried strength. "It will end soon, won't it?" The Apache did not answer. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his eyes fixed on the darkness where the glow drew closer, closer still. The desert held its breath, the rocks silent witnesses to the storm about to break. And there, on the edge of the mesa, with the world closing in, the blind girl and the Apache stood together, caught between past and future, hunted by enemies, bound by fate. The climax had not yet come, but its shadow loomed large, pressing down on every heartbeat, every breath, until the night itself seemed ready to shatter. The torches drew nearer, their glow flickering across the edge of the mesa. The blind girl stood still, her shawl clutched close, feeling the heat of the fire behind her and the cold wind pressing against her face. The Apache did not move, his body taut as a drawn bow, his rifle steady in his hands. The stallion shifted restlessly nearby, sensing the weight of the moment. The desert, vast and ancient, seemed to hold its breath, At last, voices carried across the night. Harsh, impatient, driven. The sheriff's voice rose above them, steady but worn, calling for the Apache to step forward. The girl's heart hammered, though she could not see the faces gathering in the dark. She only knew that they were close enough now that she could hear the rattle of spurs, the creak of saddles, the sharp breath of horses. The Apache said nothing at first. His silence was heavy like stone. Then, when the voices pushed nearer, he raised his voice, calm but unyielding. She was alone. You left her to die. Now, she is with me. His words rang out against the canyon walls, each syllable carrying both judgment and defiance. The men shifted uneasily. Some muttered under their breath, anger laced with shame. The sheriff held his ground, his gaze fixed on the figure by the fire. He could not deny the truth in the Apache's words. He had seen the girl stand in the dust, unwanted, and he had done nothing. Now, that truth pressed heavier than any rifle barrel. The blind girl, trembling, found her voice. She stepped forward, her small hands outstretched. I was nothing to you, she said, her voice wavering but clear. You all turned away, but he did not. Her words pierced the air like an arrow, silencing the murmurs. She did not see their faces, but she felt their shame in the long quiet that followed. The sheriff spoke again, his voice lower, tired. The town is afraid. They fear what they don't understand. They fear what might come if you stay with him. His words carried more honesty than command, as if he was speaking not just to her, but to himself. The Apache did not lower his rifle, but he did not fire. He looked at the girl, her blind eyes lifted toward the sound of voices, her frame trembling yet unbroken. In that moment, the choice became clear, not just for him, but for all of them. She was not a prize to be claimed or a burden to be cast aside. She was a person, small but fierce in her survival, living truth no one could deny. The sheriff stepped forward slowly, holding up an empty hand. If she chooses to stay with you, we will not stop her, he said. The men behind him stirred, some in protest, but he silenced them with a look. We failed her once. I will not fail her again. The girl felt her breath catch. She turned her face toward the Apache, her voice soft but steady. I choose to stay. The words left no room for doubt. She did not belong to the town that had shunned her, nor to the whispers of fear that had chased her. She belonged to herself, and she chose the path that had begun when he lifted her from the dust. The Apache lowered his rifle at last, the firelight glinting off its barrel before he slung it across his back. He nodded once to the sheriff, a silent agreement between men who had seen too much. Then he turned to the girl, steadying her with his hand. The posse shifted uneasily, but none moved forward. They had no claim left to make. When the men rode back toward the village, the sheriff lingered a moment longer. His eyes met the Apache's, and though no words passed, something unspoken did. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps regret. Then he turned, his horse carrying him into the dark, leaving only silence behind. The girl and the Apache stood together at the edge of the mesa, the night stretching wide before them. She listened to the fading hoofbeats until they vanished, leaving only the whisper of the wind. She felt lighter somehow, as though the weight of years had lifted from her shoulders. For the first time, she did not feel unwanted. In the days that followed, they traveled further into the desert, away from the village, away from the whispers of men. The girl learned more with each step. She learned to hear the flight of birds, to smell the coming of rain, to feel the ground beneath her as if it spoke its secrets to her feet. The Apache taught her not with long words, but with patience, with silence, with the steady rhythm of survival. She grew stronger, her hands surer, her heart less afraid. Back in the village, the whispers did not die, but they changed. Some said she had been taken by force, others that she had chosen her path. The boy who had once shared bread with her stood tall in the square, telling anyone who would listen that she had spoken with her own voice, that she had chosen her fate. And slowly, though not all at once, some began to question what it meant that they had let her go so easily. The sheriff carried his own burden of reflection. Each night, as he sat on his porch with the desert stretching silent around him. He thought of her words, of her small voice cutting through the night with truth sharper than any bullet. He knew the town would never forget what had happened, and neither would he. For the girl, life was no longer a cage of shadows. Though she could not see, she had begun to live more fully than ever before. The Apache, steady as the land itself, walked beside her, not as captor, not as savior, but as companion. Together, they carved a path through the wilderness. Not toward safety or fear, but toward freedom. She thought often of the village, of the life that might have been if someone had reached out sooner. But she did not dwell on bitterness. Instead, she carried forward the truth she had spoken that night on the mesa. She had been unwanted, but she was no longer unseen. The desert had given her a voice, and she would not let it be silenced again. Their journey did not end in a single place, for the land was wide and endless. But it ended in choice, in the simple act of standing tall in a world that had once turned its back. She walked on, blind but unafraid, her hand brushing against the Apache's arm, her heart steady with each step. The wind carried their story across the plains, through canyons and rivers, through villages that whispered their names. Some called it strange, others called it defiance. But to the girl, it was only life, hard and real, carved from pain and carried forward by hope. And so, as the sun set on another day, casting long shadows across the desert, the blind girl sat beside the Apache, listening to the crackle of fire, the call of coyotes, the soft rustle of the stallion nearby. She felt the world not with her eyes, but with every breath, every heartbeat. She was no longer the girl left behind. She was the girl who chose, the girl who walked forward, the girl who lived. The desert would remember, and so would she.